Aujourd'hui, nous avons l'honneur, et vraiment je la remercie, je suis vraiment très contente que nous débutions ce séminaire avec Barbara Allen, qui est professeure à Virginia Tech. Les travaux de Barbara Allen étaient connus dans la communauté des STS avant qu'elle ne décide de venir en France pendant une période mener des travaux dont elle va nous parler. Et les travaux qu'elle a menés sur la région de Fos-sur-Mer, je ne vais pas dévoiler de quelle nature il s'agit, mais ont eu une influence importante à la fois pour questionner les pratiques des agences de régulation en France et des agences d'expertise, mais je dirais peut-être plus que ça, pour questionner aussi les chercheurs en sciences sociales sur le regard qu'ils portent sur leur propre territoire et la manière dont ils peuvent mener des travaux sur un espace qui nous est peut-être trop familier. Donc Barbara Allen a mené un ensemble de travaux, d'abord sur la région, je ne dirais même pas d'abord parce qu'elle avait aussi mené des travaux sur les catastrophes, mais un travail absolument marquant qui était sur la Cancer Alley, la vallée du cancer de la Louisiane, qui a été un travail extrêmement remarqué à l'international. Et ces travaux qui ne sont, j'espère, pas terminés, it's not finished. I speak in French at the beginning,
okay. I understand some.
Ne sont pas terminés, j'espère, appelleront aussi au développement de travaux à la fois similaires dans le prolongement de ce qui a été mené. Donc, on va lui laisser la parole pour 45 minutes d'intervention, 50 minutes à peu près. Elle sera ensuite discutée par Catherine Bourguin et Laura Barbier. Donc Catherine Bourguin qui est au CERMES 3 et Laura Barbier qui a une double affiliation au ministère de la Transition écologique et au CERMES 3, et qui chacune va probablement discuter et commenter à partir de perspectives qui ne sont pas exactement les mêmes. Laura Barbier a travaillé sur l'épidémiologie et la logique des preuves en épidémiologie. Catherine Bourguin, en plus de ses travaux sur la génétique, a eu des implications fortes dans la fondation des sciences citoyennes, et donc un regard aussi qui ne concerne pas que les questions de santé-environnement. J'ai commencé à parler en français sans me poser de questions, parce que je voulais absolument, même si cette séance est en anglais, et on aura une autre séance dans le programme en anglais au mois de décembre, je voudrais insister sur le fait qu'il faut se sentir absolument libre de poser des questions en français. Ils peuvent être traduits par Catherine et Laura, parce que vous serez assises à côté. Par ailleurs, si vous avez des difficultés ou ça va trop vite, faites le signe. Barbara parle un anglais très clair par rapport à d'autres collègues américains et parlera à un rythme relativement, je pense, un peu lent, mais faites signe si jamais vous avez des difficultés. En tout cas, sentez-vous parfaitement à l'aise. Voilà, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Soraya and Nina and the seminar for inviting me. This is my first public presentation since COVID, so I feel nervous, like a new presentation. So for me, this is an important step to normalcy, right? So I'm going to speak today about this topic of participatory science, environmental social movements, and structural change. And I'm going to primarily focus on the project I did near Marseille, in Fos-sur-Mer and Port-Saint-Louis-du-Rhône. And so before I start, I want to talk a little bit about some STS ideas that are emerging or have been around for a while in the science and technology studies community. My own training was at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which was an STS program known for its activist and public-facing research. So my own background comes in that kind of vein. When I was there, for example, Kim Fortune, a scholar at STS, was on my dissertation committee. Because I got my PhD when I was older, because Kim is younger than me, but Many of my committee members were actually younger than I was. It was good. I was glad to be an older student. And so Kim's work on the asthma files was a kind of public-facing website project that aggregated asthma, particularly qualitative data worldwide. Another person at Rensselaer is Abby Kinchy. She was not on my committee. She's a new faculty member compared to me. And her book, Science by the People, recently came out. And this, again, was talking about a kind of public-facing or engaged program for science and technology studies. My current institution is Virginia Tech, is also known for this kind of public-facing research. My colleague, Gary Downey, and his collaborator, and I pronounce his name badly, Tune Zuiderak Jurak, just recently published this book called Making and Doing. It's open access at MIT Press. You can download it for free. And it's a set of case studies by various both European and American colleagues about doing work in an engaged way and what that looks like. And there's a diversity of kinds of engagement that go on in what Gary and Tune call the travel of knowledge, the travel of STS. So this kind of frame, this is where I come from. So I think it's important to say that before I talk about my project. So I'm going to define two of the terms in my title. I'm going to define participatory science, and I'm going to define structural change, because I think environmental social movements, people have some idea of what that is, and it's also a range of things. So participatory science can be many kinds of things, and I list here a number of popular ideas about what it is, and scholarly ideas, from citizen science, which we now call civic science, because citizens is a limiting term, because not everyone is a citizen. Street science, sort of science from below. Popular epidemiology, which was termed by Phil Brown, about doing kind of everyday ad hoc epidemiology in communities. Consensus conferences, and I forget what they're called in France, but they're events where people come together and they're sort of organized around discussion around science and technology. And French scholar Brice Laurent has written some books on this, and as have other people. And then there's crowdsourcing. We all know what that is. Hockley has written about that. Then there's community-based participatory research and participatory action research, which comes more from public health, but in recent years, STS scholars have started to engage with that. And then there's what I've sort of brought to the table that I think is important, is this collaborative data analysis. Today we live in the age of big data and lots of data and sort of swimming in data. And how can that data be made democratic? How can people, everyday people, have some input into how data that changes their lives and affects their lives, how can they have input into that data? And that's one thing that my project talks about. So sorry about the wordy slides, but I think especially for some of you that may read English but maybe not understand me as much, I felt it was important. So I wanted to talk about what demarcates participatory science from more conventional kinds of science. And that is that it builds on the active participation and significant participation of people, and explicitly on their expertise, what they know about their health or their environment, because my project is an environmental health project. So in concert with this kind of participation must come a realization on the part of science, allied agencies, and institutions of their own cultural limits, so that they need to be structurally and cognitively open to new forms of knowledge and participation. And at the end, we'll come to what happened with my project when we met Santé Publique France and the ARS and the DRIAL various agencies, because it is interesting that public agencies sometimes have an uneasy fit with science from without. And I think that permeability between agency and publicly made science, that permeability needs to be fostered for change, but we'll come to that. So when people for whom the science matters are able to participate in shaping or making science, this leads to greater social and place-based contextualization of knowledge. So some science studies scholars have argued that deeply situated science that includes the social distribution of expertise is often more empirically reliable, yielding higher quality socially relevant results. And again, many scholars, both European and American, have come to this conclusion. So what is meant by structural change? Because I want to define this term as well. So in a recent article in the open access journal Environmental Health Perspectives, there was a critical interpretive synthesis of 150, I think it was something like 250 articles and 150 something case studies, and to determine what participatory research for environmental justice would look like. What's successful? Like metrics not only for success, but for structural change. Because you don't just want knowledge in an academic sphere. You want to change the structures that make uneven power distributions. So they said in this particular article, and it's a really key article, I highly advise people to take a look at it. Davis and Ramirez-Andreotta define structural change as projects affecting the macro or meso level determinants of health, such as zoning policy, economic policy, political power distribution, changes in the built environment, public service provisions, environmental policy enforcement. They explained that research that simply focuses on educational programs such as increasing risk awareness or environmental health literacy and self-instituted protective measures are not included in their definition of structural change, because in their mind, these are neoliberal frames that each person is responsible for protecting themselves. Like you're responsible for yourself, full stop. And for research to advance structural change, the responsibility to mitigate pollution, to improve health outcomes and environmental conditions lies with the economic, social, and political structures that produce it. Not poor individuals trying to figure it out, but the structures that made this happen, this poor environment. So in 2014, we began the FOSS-EPSIL project, and I'm going to call it FOSS-EPSIL or just EPSIL, and this is the acronym, so you know what I'm speaking of. We began this project, and it was funded by the ANSES, which is the French Agency for Food, Environmental, and Occupational Health and Safety. And the project location was just outside of Marseille, in two towns that were right on the front of the industrial zone. The industrial zone is large, but there were two towns that were really immersed in pollution. And those two towns were Fos-sur-Mer and Port-Saint-Louis-du-Rhône. And here I have some images of, for example, the beach at Fos-sur-Mer with the plants, and the Gaz de France depot is actually on their beach, and along with petrochemical facilities. And then you can see the location of housing in relationship to facilities. In this particular image, these are social housing projects, and they're right up against the chemical plants. And this is a much more middle class neighborhood, but still the adjacency to the chemical zone is very close. So it didn't matter if you were poor or rich, everybody was in this soup, so to speak. So this area, why did I choose this area? This area is the largest, I think, or maybe we should say one of the largest industrial areas in France, with 50 Seveso sites, high hazard facilities, hundreds, like I think the number is like over 400 when you count all the different facilities in the zone, of chemical, gas, steel, and oil refineries. There is huge logistics cities of just piles of containers, because it's the industrial port of Marseille, so Many containers come in, and so it's a logistics port with trucks, a large amount of truck traffic. And it's more than 2 times the size of Louisiana's Cancer Alley in terms of an industrial corridor, which it was my first study. So to my mind, it was a gigantic polluted industrial corridor. Now, one of the things that makes this an environmental justice community or towns, and I talk about this when I speak with my postdocs in France or French scholars. In the US, because of our history of slavery, not in part, because of our history of slavery and the aftermath of that and policies that followed, we have a situation in the United States where a lot of times communities of color, particularly African American communities, live with fence lines to industry, and that is the case in Louisiana. The people that live right up against industry are about 90% African American. So we talk about it in racial terms. I know in France that's not a comfortable thing. It's not, you don't collect demographic data based on race, you don't, or religion. In the US we don't collect data on religion either. But at the base of what environmental justice means is having power. And in the case of all of the little towns in this zone, they were a dedicated industrial port. Originally it was the Grand Maritime Port de Marseille. And because it was in a dedicated zone, or ZIP, as they called it, they had no power over siting of new facilities, any kind of pollution controls around it. They had zero power. Their mayors and elected officials, all they could do is sort of raise their hand and yell loudly, but they had no power over this because of their location in this controlled zone. And that's the primary definition of an environmental justice community, having no power over what goes on in your neighborhood, in your zone. So in 2005, they lost a huge battle to site the Gaz de France depot on their beach. So their tiny little beach now has this huge gas depot of ships coming in. And then in 2010, the sort of, what we say in English, the straw that broke the camel's back, was they lost a battle against siting an incinerator to burn all the garbage of Marseille. So big ships come in from Marseille and dump all the garbage into Fosse, into the little town of Fosse-sur-Mer, and it was their 3rd incinerator. So in this small town of 16,000 people, they now have 3 incinerators and all this industry. So the citizens would, they protested, they marched, they had very violent marches actually. They did a lot of things to make their feelings known. And their main argument was, we're sick. This is causing our families to be sick. Everybody's ill, and they're getting sicker. But they had no proof, because the state would say, well, we don't think you're sick. And so the background for why I did the Fosse-sur-Mer study is this. There had been in the past 15 years before the study, 13 health studies done by the state that said that the people in Fosse-sur-Mer and Port St. Louis and the chemical zone they weren't sick. There was no proof that they were ill, or the studies were inconclusive. They couldn't really make a conclusion one way or the other, or they never completed the studies. So that was the answer to all 13 studies fit into one of these categories. So the state studies did not confirm what the residents and the local doctors believed regarding illness and prevalence of risk. So the studies were deemed not relevant or credible by the residents. So additionally, twice citizen groups went to occupy the regional health offices in Marseille, the ARS, only to be escorted off the property by heavily armed riot police. 4,000 people in the region signed a petition asking, I would say begging for health data, only to be ignored. And the local doctors we interviewed expressed frustration because even they could not get data about health. So we come back to this environmental justice movement, we're going to call it, people that are powerless, that are living in regions which they have no power for a variety of reasons. So the environmental justice movement suffers from a resource problem. There's a lack of relevant science for the residents, for the citizens, and sometimes this is called undone science, because it's not like the science couldn't be done, it just has not been done. So the science that residents want are science that answer local questions, that are developed with the locals, the science made with them, it's analyzed by the locals, and it's in the voice of the locals. So what they want is a report of their own that they can use as a tool, as a scalpel, as a hammer to try and change their environmental situation and thus their health situation. So, and then the other problem is that there's a prevalence of non-relevant or non-credible state and corporate science that is used to deny empirical health observations of residents. And in France, I just discussed those 13 surveys in which they couldn't show anything, they were inconclusive, they said there was no problem. In the United States, it's actually worse. They actually produce studies that affirmatively claim there is no problem, and I'll talk about that at the end. So, and this is an important note at the end in my green ink here, that in the Fosse-Tang-de-Berre industrial area, epidemiology data was the primary science that the state used to take action or not in response to resident claims of illness. So it's rigorous, credible epidemiology that needs to be done. So one of the pitfalls of citizen science or civic science is oftentimes groups do what's easy to do, that they can do inexpensively or that's simple, like going out and collecting water samples. That's a thing. Or going out and measuring bird migration patterns or lack thereof, So you go out and you measure things in nature, or collect water samples, or even you can do air sampling with buckets, which they do in Louisiana. They have these vacuum buckets that everyday citizens can use. The problem with just using any kind of science is that when you bring it back to the state and to agencies, they look at it and it doesn't match the metrics of how they do policy. Right? Now you have bucket information or you have water sampling information, but it's not done in the way that they respect. Now you could say, well, we need to change the way the state does science, but that's a much longer project. I argue that let's go back to the state on their same terms with epidemiology. So I moved from doing observation-style research in polluted communities, which was my first research in Louisiana. I moved to doing more participatory research with the communities, because I always wanted to know what would happen if a community fighting pollution actually had the epidemiology health data that they had been asking for, actually had the data, the same kind of data the state used to make decisions. So I hypothesized that it would be an effective tool, and to test the hypotheses, I obtained epidemiological data for the residents of Fosse-sur-Mer and Port St. Louis du Rhône. And I used an American style of research called community-based participatory research to collect a random door-to-door self-reported health data from the residents of these two towns. And there's more information on what CBPR is, that's the acronym we call it. But at the very base of CBPR is that people are involved in the problem definition, the research design, the data collection, and data analysis and interpretation. And number 4 was my innovation to this whole process, because in the past it hasn't been that emphasized in CBPR work. They sort of collected the data and then did a report and actually didn't go back to the citizens for analysis. And I argue that this is what made this project so impactful, leading to structural change. Okay, so the Fosse-Seal project was an STS-informed project, how to produce relevant epidemiology for local residents. So we started it by identifying the topics, designing the questionnaire, designing the random sampling strategy, and recruiting participants. And up at the top, the photo is me and my then epidemiologist, Allison Cohen, and we were looking at a map with a leader of a local environmental group, and he was laying out the various neighborhoods so that the neighborhoods made sense to the people. So the final report had neighborhoods and divisions of neighborhoods that they recognized. It came from their own people. So then we went door to door and collected data on 816 households, which was 9% of the populations. And the residents participated in, and I'll come back and talk about this, they analyzed the data, they made sense of the data. They actually gave us new ideas for new analysis that we went back and did and then came back to them. And then we drafted the final report, but we asked for their input to be sure it had their words. We quoted from them, not using their names, but saying a resident of Foss or a resident of Port St. Louis. And so the report was filled with their words, their language, their hypotheses. And we also brainstormed with the residents on what are you going to do next with this report? What should we do next to give you more data? So we recruited, I'm going to go kind of quickly through some of this. We recruited, engaged the participants. We had flyers. We put things on in cafes and in the mayor's city hall. We contacted the newspaper that we were out there. We walked in there. You can see one of my team members. She's actually interviewing someone who's trying to fix their car. So we went all around. That wasn't considered part of our random sample, but so everybody knew we were there. And in the end, this is the data that we got. We showed significantly elevated amounts of asthma and cancer, diabetes, type 1 and type 2, type 1 being an autoimmune disease that's environmentally triggered. Chronic illnesses were extremely high, chronic skin conditions were very high, chronic eye irritation was just like endemic, right? So, and we also published this in, did we do that? We published, I didn't mean to put both of these up here. So you can take a look. And then we had the French national statistics that we got out of publications. And then we went to the past studies to see what the state had said. And they said that they either hadn't done it or they said that the illness was not elevated in the case of cancer. For our scientific publications, we had things like confidence intervals. There's a lot more scientific information you need to have when you publish it to validate it, and I'll show you some of those charts in a minute. So after we had that initial data, we held 36 collaborative workshops over a period of several months. And these workshops were open. Again, we plastered the town with flyers. We put things up on our website. We went to the mayor's offices. We got a number of people participating, some multiple times, other people participating only once. And each group had from 3 to 14 participants. And you can see groups sitting around a table. And we would begin with introductions and talk about confidentiality and respecting speakers. And this was important because sometimes we would invite doctors and professionals if they wanted that. And we wanted to be sure that the doctors and professionals didn't overwhelm the residents trying to speak. So that we began each collaborative workshop with the initial presentation of our data that you just saw. And then we asked them things like, do these data make sense? What feelings do these data evoke? Are you surprised? Is anything missing? What else would you like to see? And so we and that would just start the conversation between all the participants who were residents in the area. And then the groups always concluded with the question, what are the next steps? What are solutions? And then from each collaborative workshop, we would make a PowerPoint about what happened in that workshop, so that the next collaborative workshop, we would have that to show them, so that each workshop started having all the information of what the workshops before had said, their ideas. And so we weren't kind of reinventing the wheel each time. We built knowledge in these towns through iterative workshops. So the ideas that emerged right away in the data workshops were that they wanted themed groups. They wanted to come together and deeply talk about asthma or cancer or diabetes. And they would like to have a medical professional there or air measurement specialist there, so that when they were talking, they could refer to an expert. And they wanted a synthesis of each previous focus group's discussion, which is what I just mentioned. That synthesis was important, so they weren't just saying the same thing. So we shifted our process to include all these. This analysis in collaborative workshops with local people was really productive because they understood their health in context, and they could discuss things. Like one of the health contradictions that was really, it was kind of the shocking first discovery we made, was the worker health contradiction, because what our study showed is that worker health, the people that worked in the industries, and resident health was the same. They were equally sick. So people that didn't even work in industry were just as sick as people that did. Now there's a contradiction there, because there's a concept called the healthy worker effect, that people that work in really toxic industries, if they're very fragile people or that they get sick, they quit. So people that stay in these industries tend to be healthier to begin with. So that doesn't say that the workers, and the other thing is our sample size of workers was small. I think we had 250 workers. So for some of the questions they had, we didn't have statistical significance to show any prevalence of elevated health effects. That doesn't mean they weren't there, and we explained that to the people. The other thing that the residents did is they hypothesized about causation. We did not discuss causation as a team because we can't make causal claims. We just produce health data. But the residents themselves can think of causal ideas, and we would go back to the medical literature and research and see if there was evidence of certain kinds of pollution causing asthma or certain kinds of pollution causing cancer. And if there were, we would bring that back to the workshops and tell them, look what we found in the medical literature. Not to say yes to their causal claim, but to say that what you're thinking is not crazy. Other people have studied this, and it is so. So the kinds of suggestions that they gave to us to analyze were there connections between the fertility of women and industry workers, their husband, that worked in industry? Were there clusters of illnesses in a single person? Were there correlations of illnesses with factors such as what they were eating, because we surveyed what they ate, and was it local? And then were there illnesses related to specific neighborhoods? So the fertility question, we didn't have enough statistical power to show one way or the other. But for clusters of illnesses, we found some shocking revelations that in individuals, there were clusters of illnesses that go together. And the doctors were very excited about this, because it means if someone comes in with throat irritation, it means they should look further, because there might be 2 other illnesses in that person that the symptom didn't indicate. So, and that's led to some studies that are going on now. So I don't want to take time, but I just want to make a point that we did speak with in the workshops. We took careful notes on what the residents said, and you get an idea of what it's like to live with. In this case, this was from the asthma and respiratory illness group. That some kind of qualitative. We have a lot of qualitative data for this project, lots of it that we only recently published an article on. And then even the local doctors would say, it's not surprising to find more respiratory illnesses, but there are things that I cannot put into words. What's interesting for me are these nose and throat symptoms, because usually I have the impression that in 20 years they're going to lead to something else. And the cluster of illnesses started to show that. It starts up here, but eventually you have other problems that are related. And that's something that came from the local citizens asking us to do this analysis, because we would have never thought of this. So just one quick other comment about this. We divided the town of, this is the town of Foster-Mer, into neighborhoods per the residents' viewpoint of what counts as different neighborhoods. And we did some data analysis. Again, these are without any confidence intervals. These are just, they wanted to see this. So we gave this to them to kind of understand their health, because building trust involves responding to the people in the workshop. And one of the interesting findings was that in this neighborhood called Les Carabins, which I've highlighted in blue, is the wealthier neighborhood in Foss. And one of the things that the state had told us is, you need to standardize your data for for income level, because poor people are sicker, and that's just known, so that's the way it is. Now, I don't know why poor people should be sicker. That actually seems like an environmental injustice to me. Poor people should have the same health as everybody. But in this case, it flies in the face of what the state had been saying, because actually in this case, these wealthier people have much higher levels of cancer and much higher levels of diabetes, because it has to do with what they're breathing. Bodies are bodies. Poor bodies and rich bodies, they're bodies. So that was a kind of interesting side note. So the kind of data that we published, just to give you a quick view, was the kind of data that you must have to publish in scientific journals and medical journals. So we had confidence intervals, respondent numbers, and we actually did a third survey in a peripheral town that's on the edge of the industrial zone, because there was some interest in that for another reason that I'm not going to talk about here. So just an idea, because if you don't publish the data, then the state or whoever can claim, well, the state is just ad hoc. No, it's not. It's been peer reviewed and published. So we did that with all our data. So to talk a little bit about another one of my research frames, for the participatory process of workshopping health data, when you invite input and reflection from the people whose health is represented by the data, it aligns with science communication research on attention and motivation. And this is the work of Luc Pia, who was he was the head of the social, behavioral, and environmental division of the National Science Foundation until last year, so he's a very big scholar in the US. And he said that people have a greater capacity and working memory for the understanding and personal processing of science if it connects to both people's pre-existing beliefs, i.e. that in FOSS they're ill, that they're sick, and that they are sick, they're not imagining they're sick, and two, if it connects to concrete events or outcomes that impact their lives or those that they care about. And they do care about their health and the health of their children and their family. So those two things are important for kind of implanting science in the brains of people, to put it in lay language. So for participatory science to advance an ongoing project is one thing, but generating whole new knowledge structures and cognitive frameworks is quite another. And I claim that these workshops are a way to create new structures and cognitive frameworks for citizen empowerment. That's my claim. So the final report that we released, it interwove the quantitative data, the charts, with the qualitative input from the collaborative workshops. It included the narratives, like the ones I showed you a few slides back. Also included were causal hypotheses of the residents, not us, of the residents, backed up by citing medical studies published elsewhere. So the final report was very accessible because it was written from their perspective and included their narratives and ideas alongside our statistics. So the local capacity building for the project, which was important for structural change in the future, involved these robust, relevant report conclusions. We built a local network of medical specialists and the air, they were called AtmosSud, the Air Monitoring Association. And those network specialists were really helpful in kind of building some trust with the community. There was resident insight into knowledge building and hypothesizing about causation. In other words, they used their own inductive reasoning to think, why am I sick? Why is cancer elevated? Why is asthma so high? Why is diabetes type 1 so high? And then the brainstorming about next steps resulted in both pragmatic and innovative ideas. In conclusion, it led to a confident understanding and ownership of the science and report that they helped make. Residents emerged with a full-throated ability to use their science. So, and this wasn't our project, but when our project was going on, they organized all kinds of things, because we never aligned ourselves with political parties or any kind of politics or any lawsuits or anything, but a lot of, like, here was the March of the Cobayes, they headed up to Paris and Brussels presenting their case. There was a big lawsuit actually multiple lawsuits that have come out of this, the first ever in France, about the state the state endangering the citizens' lives, and also companies particularly endangering their lives. And the New York Times published a piece on it that about the criminal complaints against industry and the civil suit against the state. And I think a number of these lawsuits have failed, but there's a bunch more in the system because they're using them as a prod to constantly keep this issue in the press, because that's how they believe change is going to happen. Constantly they're just slamming them with these lawsuits. It's kind of a crazy thing, knowing that they're not going to win them, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is the cudgel of the lawsuit and the press that it gets. So that's a different, I want to pivot back to this. So the selected outcomes to date, which I argue are structural change on the ground, and we were featured in that article that I mentioned at the beginning, talking about projects that resulted in structural change, and they featured 4 of the projects, ours being one of them. And the mayor of Foss has used the data to challenge re-permitting, and Juan, he sent this letter, we have a copy of it. The mayor of Foss sent a letter to the mayor of Marseille, who at that point was Gaudin, and said, excuse me, but we don't want you to expand this because we have health problems and we have data, and sent him a copy of the report. Multiple mayors have used the study to stop excess pollution permits from companies. ArcelorMittal was forced to carry out maintenance so that their emissions were lower. The local Risk Communication Association began an official process to inform citizens and listen and respond to them. I'm not sure that's structural, but I put it in that category. And then doctors at the local hospital have initiated studies to look at clusters of illnesses and diabetes. And down here, on a national level, the state created a cancer registry down there, and they've been requesting it for more than 20 years, and they've now created it. And the residents are strongly pushing for oversight on the board. You don't want to just leave the state to their own devices. In 2019, the lawsuit with 260 residents, 7 citizen associations, and several labor unions all came together to file these lawsuits. So this was a big group of people, not simply a few people, a lot of people, labor unions and associations. The group of legislatures have presented a resolution to the French National Assembly. This was about a year and a half ago, citing the problems in the Gulf of Foss. And the French Health Service they submitted our methodology for national level verification, and they've adopted a participatory process in contested areas, and now they're actually doing a study in Rouen following the industrial fire in 2019. They are supposedly doing one in Lac, a participatory study, and there's some other towns that I've heard of that I don't want to list because I'm not positive. So this is a groundbreaking and vastly different approach to health studies, and a shift in how the French Health Service has done studies in the past. That said, there's been complaints that they feel like they're not getting enough participation because the state still wants to kind of hold control. So there's been some, like I know in the situation in LAC, the citizens still aren't happy with their level of participation, because once something is institutionalized, it sometimes loses some of the things that made it so robust as far as citizen participation went. But at least it's a good step. So in the article that I mentioned at the beginning by Davis and Ramirez Andriato, they have a huge list of they went through all of these case studies and listed the kinds of things that lead to structural change. And they had 150 to 55 case studies, and I just picked out some of the elements, but there's twice as many, I think, in the article. So, a longer partnership with a duration of more than 4 years. We were in Foss almost 8. Although doing the actual work, it was maybe more like 4 or 5 years. More than one source of data, mapping, interviews, surveys, at least one qualitative and one quantitative source. This idea of the hybridization of qualitative and quantitative data is, I think, really important for scientific impact at an agency level. That the research questions were informed by local knowledge, the study design was informed by local knowledge, and the cultural membership of at least one academic researcher that is a member of the community and shares key aspects with the community. And our project director for the FOSSEPSIL project, the first one was Yolande Verrier, and you could see Shell Chemical from her front yard. She grew up there. And that was also very important, because if you're outside researchers, you should make a point to try and hire somebody from the community, or, for example, if in America, if we were going to go to an African American community and do research, we would want to have a team member, maybe not from the neighborhood, but from that cultural group. And that just, it's more effective. So, and you can think why without me explaining it. And so did you do data translation for public action? We did that at every collaborative workshop. At the end, we asked, what do you want to do with your data? And they brainstormed together. Okay, I see we're reaching, I'm now gonna, so let me go. We formally ended the project this year in June 2022. We held meetings with the residents, that's them sitting in that room, and the mayor died several weeks later of lung cancer, and he was not a cigarette smoker, the mayor was. And he was not an old man. So anyway, we held a meeting, and then on August 31st, 2022, the sous-prefet for the environment of Bouches-du-Rhône called a meeting to discuss the project, and there was the Santé Publique France, the ARS, people from the DRIAL, Atmos Sud, the director of Institut Éco-Citoyen, the representative of the unions, their medical officers. It was a big group of representing a lot of different voices, and they spent 3 hours discussing our project after we presented it. And there was debate. I mean, I can't say that the Santé Publique France just loves our project exactly, you know. But the Atmos Sud guy, the air measurement people, were always sort of on our side without saying, because I think they knew there was problems. And at the end of the meeting, after we talked about the EPSIL process, the director of Atmos Sud said, because there was argument. He said, well, it's obvious there was a before and there is an after EPSIL. And the audience agreed that the genie will not go back in the bottle. The citizens will not be disciplined subjects, that they now feel that they have a voice. And theoretically, just quickly, the project advances 2 major research frames in STS, especially those addressing issues of environmental justice. And the first issue it looks at is the literature on epistemic bias and justice, that the literature the project's methodological approach is designed to provide formative and inclusive space for meaning making and science integrative lay interpretation of data. And this goal furthers the literature on collaborative data analysis and using that as an engagement object, which creates trust, which alters the dynamics of trust and authority in the co-production of knowledge with scientists and non-scientists. And the second thing is we advanced the knowledge of participatory science for policy relevance, and it's advanced through repositioning citizen science as official science remade through the interpretive and deliberative processes of citizens. So, and this will be my, I've talked too long, but I'm really interested in projects that are generative projects, and that scholars learning and creating with non-academics in ways that highlight the many epistemologies, technologies, and labors that make up technoscience to contribute to its reorganization and to larger structural change. This is Kelly Moore's work. And this is counter to what I call extractive social science, where you go into communities or places and you take your data and off you go with your academic articles, and the people are left the same that they always were. You've extracted something from them and given nothing to them. So it's not generative or generous. And then the knowledge frame, this is my knowledge frame. Before there was a bunch of people, they were just yelling at the prefect and the state. And now that they have knowledge, they can be at the negotiation table, wherever that might be, with their knowledge. And industry has their science, and the state has their science, and now the citizens have their science, their epidemiology. So I'm in the process of working on a project back in Louisiana to get epidemiology data. And what I want to do, where we almost have funding. I think we're going to get funding. I just submitted the second round of the grant application this morning. what we want to do to, one of the states, I don't know if I put this, one of the problems with this, did I put this in here? One of the problems with the FOSS-EPSIL when the Santé Publique France did our analysis of our methodology was, and this is a problem, according to Alison Cohen, my epidemiologist, that always happens with epidemiology, is there was a question about sample bias. We went door to door in a random fashion, but some people didn't open the door, so we just went to the next door. So there could have been people not opening their door, could have been more healthy or at work, right? So was there a sample bias? The other kind of bias would have been the way we standardized our data. We standardized the data. We had a few more women answer the survey than men. So we standardized for gender, but we didn't standardize for socioeconomics, as I mentioned before. And they said, well, that could be a problem. And so there was a third problem that they didn't like, bias, sample bias. Anyway, we're going to solve that issue in Louisiana. So the grant that we were applying for is we're going to use the state's data. Yes. So we're going to use it, and we're going to analyze it in our way. We're going to take it to workshops. They're going to workshop the state's data. So when we come back with the data, they can't say our data has sample bias. They can't say our data has standardization bias. Well, I suppose they could with it. But so we're going to get several kinds of state data and analyze it with the people, and then produce the same kind of thing, but not with self-reported data, with actual state data, and see what happens. So and also in Louisiana and Cancerelli, we're going to do this through an HBCU, a historically black college and university based in New Orleans. So the grant monies will go to them, and the majority of the grant monies will go to them, and we will go there, and we have a partner there who is a co-PI, and together we're going to go into a number of these communities and petrochemical areas and do this work. So, the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your very interesting presentation. So, Barbara Allen started her work from the observation that many studies have been conducted on health of residents of the Étang de Berre, but that they do not address the concerns of residents. So the framing resulted in a number of questions being left in the dark. So with her team, she highlighted a form of relative undone science that is supported by a disciplinary practice of asking research questions that are disconnected from the questions residents are asking. They rely on abstract rates of statistical correlation rather than data based on residents who experience health problems. So the answer to this situation was the implementation of an alternative health study, that puts at the center the subjective experience of the inhabitants and their participation all the way. For all the stages, I won't say it again because Barbara already presented it. So this is what Barbara Allen calls strongly participatory science. And David Hess identified citizen science and popular epidemiology as a mechanism of remediation to undone science. And he also lists initiatives by scientists or social scientists who set up, for example, community-based participatory research in order to get undone science done, and illustrates them with the FOSS-EPSIL study. Here, I will reflect on the conditions that need to be met for it to succeed, putting the FOSS-EPSIL case into perspective with French case studies. In France, we can talk about a participative turn in the last 10 years. I co-organized a seminar called Citizen Expertise and Public Action in 2020 and 21, and it highlighted the will of official experts to include alternative knowledge within the framework of institutionalized approaches. However, these studies seem quite different from the community-based participatory science implemented by Barbara Allen. So that's what I'll discuss from the analysis of two environmental health cases, the case of the Orbiel Valley and of the accident of Le Brésil in Normandy. I wanted to discuss also the work of Justina Moisard on air pollution in Paris, but I won't have time, so I will just focus on these two case studies. And then I will seek to show how the Société study contrasts with project of participatory science in France. Then I'll ask this question: what happens to participatory science when it is not strongly participatory, when it does not involve citizens in every step of research? And at last, I'll open the reflection on what are the conditions needed to get undone science done. So, first, let's see what happens with participatory science in health environmental case studies set in France, but without the leadership of an American social scientist. So first, the Orbiel Valley case. So the Orbiel Valley is described as a chemical Chernobyl. It is downstream of the Salsigne mine, the most important gold mine in Western Europe and first arsenic mine in the world. And it closed down in 2004. And there, pollution has accumulated and regularly becomes visible after episodes of heavy rainfall. The population has expressed worry about the health impact of this site from the 1990s after an episode of flood, and several health studies have been carried out, epidemiological and biomonitoring, over the last 20 years. In parallel, the Regional Health Agency, so ARS Occitanie, defined some guidelines for everyday life, like limiting consumption of locally grown vegetables, cleaning hands regularly, or preventing young children to put their hands in their mouths. So that was the recommendation. In response to a controversy triggered in 2019 by the revelation of some case of local children contaminated with arsenic, a participatory approach has been undertaken by the French National Health Agency, Santé Publique France, to, quote, take into account and characterize the concerns and expectations of the population regarding health risks. So the purpose was to implement an inquiry on the practices and risk perceptions of the residents of the Orbiel Valley, and so to choose the type of health study to conduct in the future and to make health recommendations evolve through the co-constructions with the local population. But then Santé Publique France recognized that their project was a failure, attributing it to the persisting mistrust of the local population and their feeling of abandonment from the state. So the interface committee that was created couldn't function well. Local elected officials didn't want to participate, and local associations practiced a systematic opposition, and then they left the committee. They called for boycott of the study of Santé Publique France, which, quote, does not deal with people's health, detailed pollution mapping or site decontamination, but with risk perceived by inhabitants. And so they produced their own biomonitoring study. So we can analyze the failure of the participatory process in light of the top-down framing of the study, also the objectives of the participative study, so deciding what the future health study would be and updating the health recommendations. These objectives had already been defined by Santé Publique France, which may explain why local associations were opposed to it. So now I will talk about the accident of Le Brizol, so in Normandy, near Rouen. So you talked about it actually, Barbara. 2 years after the Great Fire of two chemical plants in Normandy, known as the accident of Le Brizol, Santé Publique France concluded that the accident had not had serious health consequences. They only noted that short-term health effects in residents living near the factories and workers were irritation effects and stress. So here there is a discrepancy between the object of the official health study and the preoccupations of local residents concerned by the increase of environmental pathologies in the long term. So Santé Publique France highlighted that the construction of the declared health study, donc étude de santé déclarée, that they conducted, that is the definition of the protocol, the questionnaire, and the choice of the zone of study, was done within the framework of a participative approach, including people affected by the accident. But this did not include the analysis and interpretation of results. What's more, although the study put forward a set of health troubles beyond stress and anxiety, like headaches, fatigue, eye and respiratory problems, asthma, etc., It concludes that 1 year after the accident, the effects are mainly psychological. Besides, local residents were concerned about the actual exposure that they consider necessary to know in order to anticipate the illnesses to come. However, official experts have denied there was any overexposure of the local population above the historical background, which is bruit de fond in French. So, as overexposure is considered impossible in theory, doing a biomonitoring study was then considered useless, and so the population exposure has not been officially assessed. So in response to that, an association called the Sinistres de Lubrizol was formed to build a counter-expertise on chemical contamination. And in addition to developing their own toxicological expertise, they decided to conduct their own biomonitoring study to document exposures. So here we have another example of so-called participatory health studies that did not convince the exposed communities and did not produce relevant, useful knowledge that they could have mobilized to support their claim for justice. So I will go to the questions and conclusions. So we can see that the strongly participatory method Barbara Allen promotes differs from the official participatory health studies implemented in France by its ambition to tackle local residents' questions, even those that have no easy answer, and by the inclusion at all stages of the investigation. So a characteristic of the official health studies conducted in the vicinity of Étang de Berre that you described is their discrepancy with the concerns of the local residents, but it is also their inability to prove anything. So it seems that the new knowledge that you produced, Infosocial, although it is described as relevant, rigorous science or credible health science, is not so much to me about producing new and better scientific evidence, but about producing knowledge that can strengthen the claims of local residents for public actions, so to improve their health and environment. So it is not so much about actually proving a causal relationship between exposure and health effects, as the previous classic epidemiological studies were unable to do. My question is, does the knowledge produced allow to get undone science done, or is it its public echo that will then bring public authorities to carry out more studies or take over measures? So that's something I'd like to hear about, this tension between scientific evidence and a tool to favor public action. And drawing from the French cases presented here, we can try to answer the question of what happens when the participatory process is insufficiently participative. Because after a period of global positive reception by environmental and victim associations, institutional participatory projects implemented in France have been the target of widespread mistrust. So we have on the one side official participatory studies boycotted by local populations, and on the other side studies carried out by local associations, which are mainly biomonitoring ones. So as local residents who mistrust official studies, we can wonder to what extent those inclusive forms of expertise can be considered as a tool to manage public contestation by showing that something is done and keeping population busy, as pollution can difficultly be contained or removed. So it questions the status and the political value of these declared health studies when not resulting from a strongly participatory process. And I'm almost done. Lastly, we've seen various cases where French health agencies tried to implement participatory devices but with top-down approaches without really giving any power to the citizens, who were excluded from the framing and interpretation of data and decided to produce their own data. So I would like to know, but actually you already said it a bit. So I wondered if there had been more strongly participatory health studies implemented in France. And in an article, you draw attention to the differences of political culture between the US and France that would explain the greater success in the US of participatory approaches, including citizens. So do you think that strongly participatory model could be duplicated in France, and how? And also, I've got another question. To what extent can the data produced by citizens, which are mainly biomonitoring data and difficult to interpret, can be, to what extent they can be an answer to undone science?
Thank you for those questions, and thank you for your comments. I think that I have to say a lot of community-driven studies done in the United States also have had little effect. So it's not like community-done studies are great in the United States and they haven't been good in France. That's not the case. I think for a study to impact at the institutional level, so that policymakers have to listen, you have to produce the same kind of science that they do. You have to go science to science, and in this case it's epidemiology. That rules. I mean, and that's what I've come to after 25 years of studying environmental justice arenas. So I think it's the kind of science that's done. In terms of doing biomonitoring studies, those are difficult. A lot of communities have done that in the United States, and in the area of FOSS, the Institut Éco-Citoyen did a pretty large, a 40-person biomonitoring study that they then aligned with their air and water pollution data to kind of look at they produced a, 400-page study that I couldn't even figure out, and I have a PhD. So it didn't have a lot of impact because they didn't ever take it and have it. There was no community analysis. The people didn't know what it meant. I had a hard time figuring out what it meant. So I think there's a lot of issues both with the citizens need to be involved with the science and the biomonitoring, and the other thing about biomonitoring is that it's often done through volunteer samples, and those are considered very weak. Institut Éco-Citoyen did not use a volunteer sample, so they had a more random sample of the 40 people, but 40 people out of how many people in the zone? 100,000, is not a very statistically, you can't create statistical data with biomonitoring very easily. It's expensive. And statistical data rules. I can't say statistics rules. So if you can get in that game with people participating, then that's the powerful science. And do I wish it was different? Yes, but it's not.
I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to listen and discuss your very stimulating and important and even necessary work, I would say, because the impact of your work in France was, I could feel it, and so we are very happy to have you here. So I've not been personally involved in participatory research as a researcher myself for the moment. But Soraya mentioned it, in parallel to my academic work, I've been involved for more than 20 years in a French NGO called Science Citoyenne, that has been supporting the development of what we called in 2003, in a first report, the third scientific sector. Our idea, that is very similar to the diagram you showed us, was that apart from the science produced by academics alone, which is the first sector, the science produced by academics with industry, a third type of science produced by academics and civil society organizations was needed. And we draw at that time examples from patient organizations or groups or trade unions in agriculture. And really our concept, way of using the concept was insisting on the idea that the current complex socio-ecological challenges that we face required co-production of knowledge for the public good with non-profit civil society groups. So we stress on groups. I'm getting to that later. So we worked on making existing examples of such practices visible and producing, syntheses of different kinds of studies. And we support the constitution of groups for experience sharing and reflexivity on this kind of participatory research, with the aim of analyzing the very precise practical conditions, Laura mentioned some of them, for fruitful and effective collaboration between academics and citizen groups. And we also campaign for or were associated to the definition of funding calls, state funding calls or regional funding calls, but directed towards participatory research, really. And the first one was opened in 2005 here in the région Île-de-France, and that proved to be a very fruitful, I think. I remember the prediction of the call, but the call was closed rapidly after the first political change, which is important, to keep in mind. More recently, the Agence for l'environnement et la maîtrise de l'énergie launched a similar call in 2018. And regional, in Brittany also they launched a call in 2021, and in July our French National Research Agency, ANR, launched its first call for participatory research. And I would say that in all cases that I mentioned, the definition of participatory research endorsed by the code is very close to the one you called strongly participatory science, in the sense that citizens have to be, groups have to be involved in all the steps. So I think, and I'm using the same term that Laura just mentioned, that we are in a period of development and somehow institutionalization of participatory science, and even strongly participatory science in France. And I have a couple of questions and remarks related to the challenges that are attached to this term, and I think we have to address them very seriously. And you mentioned some of this point in your talk today, and the issue of lack of robustness when institutionalization comes into the game. But before answering my question, I wanted to stress 3 points of your work that I think are of particular relevance to this discussion. And the first one is the importance of your detailed analysis of the different types of participatory research, your attention on the details of action and practices at the different steps of the research project, and in particular the importance of who is asking the research question. I think this point is really a key point in every aspect, but also who's collecting the data, who's analyzing them, and the typology of the different forms of citizen involvement that you propose, and the analysis of their impact on the kind of knowledge and action that will be made possible. So the first thing is this kind of detailed analysis and also your typology. The second point is it was really important the way you capitalize on your case study, on this strong case study, to illustrate the forms of knowledge and knowledge-based policy action that can be drawn from this kind of participatory research when it's working efficiently. And the third point is the concept that you use or developed to justify this kind of strongly participatory science. Because I have been experiencing very vivid critics especially from academic colleagues, actually, who strongly reject what they consider as a direct control of research agendas by citizens, and who consider that scientists should just be let alone from all kind of interest, either from corporate or from civil society organizations. And I have experienced how ideas or concepts, in particular the one of end science, was somehow effective. It wouldn't change completely their mind, of course, but it was disturbing to see things that way. So I think we need that kind of concept, and we need to further nourish them. It's important. Now I turn to my question. So you insisted in your case study on the capacity of science, strong participatory science to produce robust and relevant knowledge in contested environments. But can you elaborate on the importance of a pre-existing controversy to develop participatory and fruitful participatory research? Do you see it as a requirement or a characteristic of the kind of fieldwork you have been working on? Or do you think that it could be developed elsewhere in other contexts? Is it specific to this kind of contested environment? My second question regards the idea of groups versus citizens. In your case study, you mentioned citizens, but you mentioned also local NGOs or groups organized. And can you tell us a little bit further on the role of these groups, their importance in the research project? Because, for instance, in its call, the Agence nationale de la recherche requires that civil society organization with social concerns to be involved in the research project, not only academics, but also, and not only citizens. So, and they have to be involved in every step of the research. So, what about developing this kind of research if there is no pre-existing organized groups locally of citizens, not just citizens, but groups of? And to what extent can concerned citizens without prior collective organization really participate in all steps of this kind of research? Now, regarding your this respective place and role of academics and citizen expertise, it's a bit of a caricature, but do you think that a well-funded and a high-standard classical epidemiology survey would have been able to collect the same kind of data that the one you collected? I mean, how precisely did the citizen expertise inform the data collection process? I'm mentioning the data collection process. Is it only, and I'm marking that through the fact that the academic know-how was equipped by additional questions and ideas, or were there other ways of informing this initial step of collecting data that would not have been possible with a more classical, well-funded, again, epidemiology study? And conversely, you mentioned it in your talk when you mentioned the importance of producing a science that is that can be heard by agencies. But to what extent is it due to the social credibility of the academics that are participating, or is there? Of course, it's important, but is there really something in the articulation between academic ways of working and ways of producing science and local ways of producing science? Is it possible to get a little bit further in this articulation? So you told us how you worked practically in the focus group, and I was wondering how you manage the distinction between academic and citizen expertise, the possible knowledge hierarchy that is there, and you mentioned that you work on facilitating the discussion. But for instance, in the ANR call, they require the integration of, we call that in France, a tiers veilleur scientifique, who's a person susceptible to facilitate the discussion and the work. So to what extent this facilitating process was indeed important or not, and is it such a crucial issue or not? That's, I wanted to have your point of view on that. And maybe finally, you use in the text, and I think you mentioned it in your talk, you mentioned the expression their own science. I like that, but of course there are different meanings and consequences of using these words, and I'm thinking here, having in mind all these colleagues and people who don't believe that we need proper science, neutral science, and I mean I'm not getting into the epistemology of that, but is it in purpose that you use these ways of saying own science versus, I don't know, science they participated in, or somehow this idea that they might have different sciences is something that can't be heard by many scientists themselves. So of course we can discuss that, but I mean the way we discuss that strategically, is this really, do you think, something important or not?
Okay. Thank you so much. My brain is exploding. So I'm going to go around your questions because I want to. I'll answer one and then come to the last one and then go back. You asked, could you do a participatory project without having it be a contested area? And you could do it, but here's the problem that you might face. The two elements from cognitive science about how people engage with science, and the two elements were that it must meet their pre-existing ideas of how they think of their environment and what's happening, and two, it has to be really important to their lives or their family or their children. And so if you're just coming to talk about, I don't know, nanotechnology or electric cars or whatever, maybe it doesn't meet those two criteria, so that they really are interested in cognitively engaging in this science. So that would be a question. If it wasn't already a controversy where people were asking questions from their own pre-existing observations. I'm going to skip to the end and talk a little bit about their own science, because I think the heart of my project and the innovation of it was the collaborative workshops, the way that the people could come together and make sense of the science and use us as their resource to get more information, to build their hypotheses, and we were simply a resource for them, making their science. And what I think is important about that is the level of trust, the level of clarity that they had about their ideas, and the level of enablement of speaking, of citizen or local voice, through this process. And I think what happened very quickly with the project is the name EPSIL and FOSSEPSIL quickly went away. Oh no, they would just call it EPSIL. Our names went away, like that I was an American or that Yolande was French and from the region, and who we all are, we disappeared. My university disappeared from it, and it was just EPSIL. It was the EPSIL project, and they went around with it because it was theirs. And it was good in a way that our academic names disappeared. I mean, my university didn't like that, and probably some of my colleagues wish they could have got a little more accolades. But what was great about it is that the academicness did disappear, and it was theirs. And that's what gave it the political legs and the speaking and the changes that happen. I'm convinced if we would have maintained control of it as ours, it would not have had the political and structural impact that it did. So the collaborative workshops and workshopping the science as you produce it is super important. I mean, super important. The other thing about the data collection process, we did door-to-door data collection, and we used our own people because of some privacy issues. They had to go through some training about privacy, and so we didn't use neighbors. If your neighbor's going around and asking you, have you ever had a miscarriage? I don't know, what would you answer? Or, have you tried to get pregnant and not able to? Or so I don't know if using like the local people to go and do that is necessarily a good idea. The questions in the survey, this is a tricky thing. The questions that we held big meetings in the beginning to ask them what their questions were, and we met with local doctors to find out what their health concerns were. But the questions themselves, which are called the measure in an epidemiology study, needed to come from peer-reviewed questions. They couldn't just be a question we make up. They had to come from other surveys specifically asked in that way. So all of our questions for the health epidemiology section came out of peer-reviewed questions from either EU-wide surveys or surveys that have been published. And that took a lot of work to do that. So that in the end we were challenged by Santé Publique France, but we weren't as challenged had we not taken those extra steps. The cognitive uptake. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention in our study, in the first study we interviewed 816 households studies. And we had a second study, if they agreed to take it, on citizen participation and civic engagement. And we got, I think, 350 people to stay longer and answer a study on civic engagement. But we had so much data that we weren't able to, we wrote one article and we analyzed this, not me, but one of my colleagues. So we actually have data that we can go back and look at, like who participates, why do they participate, what kinds of things would they be willing to participate in. We actually have that data. And if somebody was really interested, we might figure out how we could share that in a way if somebody else wanted to analyze it, because we have it. And we just haven't had the chance to dig into it. You had more questions?
The importance of pre-existing organization.
I think it's both and. If you're going to do a project, working with civic organizations, I think is a way you could do it. We wanted the population because our sample was a population size, so we had some civic organizations that participated, but they participated secretly. So what happened to us is they had been treated badly 13 times by the state, and they said we cannot put our name on a 14th study that shows there's no problem. We will be idiots. But so we will participate. You can use our space, but we will not put our name on this because we cannot be associated with another study that says we are imagining things. And in the end, they all put their name on it. Everybody was super excited. And the outcomes that I showed you from the project, we showed to the citizens at the closure meeting in June, where we showed this to them to see if this matched what they see as their outcomes, and they said yes. So they have validated those outcomes as actually happening. The civil society groups, I think could be a good way to start as a collaboration. But why would you exclude outsiders, just people in the community that also wanted to know about whatever kind of science you were making? There's a group, I'm on an ecotoxicology on the Roveltain Foundation, the Foundation of Ecotoxicology and Environmental Toxicology in Valence. And there were some groups that wanted to look at soil health, gardeners, like local gardeners. And they did a participatory study. They consulted with us, and they hired one of my researchers to go. And that wasn't a controversy like health, but the gardeners wanted to know, like, make a healthy garden. And so, you know, the answer is yes, you could work on something less politically fraught. So.
Thank you.